So what is Hunter Biden doing in White House meetings? There's a report that aides were struck by his presence during their discussions.
Look, I'm certainly not going to get into private conversations that occur. He is very close to his family, as you know. It was the week of 4th of July, which is why his family members were here last week. They walked together, and they walked together into the meeting.
Can you say if Hunter Biden has access to classified information?
No.
Well, there you heard it. The White House claiming that Hunter Biden does not have access to classified information. The first son reportedly acting as a gatekeeper to the president now, sitting in on White House meetings, alarming staffers. Top Democrat donors are not happy about it either. The co-founder of the United Talent Agency slamming Biden, telling the Daily Beast, quote, he's running against a felon, and now he's suddenly taking advice from his son, who is a convicted felon. Joining me now is Ohio Congressman Mike Turner, who's the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He's also a member of the House Armed Services and Oversight Committees. And Mr. Chairman, it's great to have you this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Maria. Thanks for having me.
I want to ask you about your investigation. You've been investigating all of this. You sent a letter to the White House Chief of Staff demanding to know what meetings Hunter Biden has been at, whether or not he's seen any classified information. Tell us what your worry is, sir.
Well, we're very concerned. You know, as the Democrats right now are struggling to determine whether or not the president can do his job for the next 4 years, we're worried about whether or not he can do it in the next 4 days. As the NATO summit launches in Washington, D.C., the president has turned to his son, Hunter Biden, as you've reported, in the Oval Office and in meetings at the White House, which is very concerning. If the president's not able to do his job, he's turning to his son. His son certainly has no qualification, should not be involved in these meetings, but certainly should not have access to classified information about some of the most important threats and secrets that face the country.
Well, you're on the Oversight Committee, and you and your colleagues have been investigating President Biden because of Hunter Biden accepting millions of dollars from adversaries. Is there a connection? Are you connecting the dots there?
Well, certainly I think this is a pattern of the family business that we've all looked at from the Bidens, because I think that the president doesn't see any division between what he does and what his son does. So it's natural for him to grab him and take him into meetings of what could be some of the most important things facing the country. But as we question whether or not the president can do the job, you've also raised the question of, well, then who is? And that certainly is of great concern to us, because it does seem as if the White House is adrift, that there's nobody behind the curtain that's running the operations of the White House, but that perhaps there are lots of work and lots of important issues that are facing the country that are just not getting done.
Yeah, and of course, our adversaries are watching all of this as well. I want to get your take on our allies. It's day 2 of the NATO summit. Talks today expected to focus on the Israel-Hamas war, Russia's war in Ukraine, and the China threat. Biden last night touted the strength of the alliance, and he claimed that Ukraine will stop Putin, even though just last week Biden insisted that he shut down Putin. Politico is reporting that European leaders are also tailoring their summit message to former President Trump, preparing to make their case to him if he's reelected in November. I know you're head of the U.S. delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, sir. What are your thoughts about the NATO meeting today in the middle of all of this?
Sure. Well, I was at the kickoff of the NATO summit last evening as the president took the podium and spoke very haltingly, did not seem to have a whole lot of energy. And I think it certainly raises the concern as whether or not he's able to meet with the leaders who are here and do the work that's necessary, including, lead the NATO summit. But President Zelensky from Ukraine was here last night at the Ronald Reagan Institute. I was there as he spoke to the group. And he said that he was concerned about his country's ability to beat Russia, not because of an issue of a willingness to fight from his people or the weapons that Russia's deploying or an advantage that Russia has, but because of the restrictions that the Biden administration has placed on his country, an inability to hit valid military targets in Russia, to fire back, and to have adequate air defense. President Zelensky is laying out that his main concern is decisions that are not being made at the White House, and that goes to our concern as whether or not President Biden is up to the job and can make the decisions necessary to give Ukraine what it needs.
Yeah, and that's what we've been talking about. I mean, Peter Doocy also, put the question to KJP. You're telling us that he's good from 10 to 8. Well, what happens if there's a nuke issue at 11 o'clock? Who's going to take the call? You're the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. What about that? What should we be most concerned with in that regard?
This is very concerning because if there is a crisis or even decision making, or even as President Zelensky has said, restrictions that are being placed on Ukraine as to how they fight back against Russia, any appeal, any recommendation for those changes are on deaf ears at the White House. Even the Secretary General of NATO has called on the United States to change the restrictions that have been placed on Ukraine. Still no response back from the White House. It's almost as if the White House itself is being run by committee. And if they all agree, we get a decision. But if they don't agree, then no decision comes out. And then that means that the United States is left without policymaking.
In the middle of all of this, there are serious worries about the impact of this wide open border. Mr. Chairman, you've talked about the potential for another 9/11. We only saw 19 individuals able to take down the trade centers and kill thousands of Americans. What should we be thinking now that 10 million illegals, some of whom have been on the terrorist watch list, are now in America on Joe Biden's watch?
Right, and you've got the reports of known ISIS connections and terrorists who have connections to international terrorist organizations who have crossed the southern border, who are here in the United States and pose a direct threat to Americans. You have the FBI director, Director Wray, going across the country and continuously saying that the lights are blinking red, that this is the highest level of a possible terrorist threat since 9/11. He's doing so because no one's listening to him at the White House. Since they're not listening to him at the White House, he's telling the American public, so everybody knows. At least he's warned everyone, but the White House is doing nothing as this threat continues to increase.
Well, what can you tell us as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee?
Well, the threat is absolutely emanating from the fact that we have an open border. This administration has allowed people to cross this border knowingly and willingly who are threats to Americans and to the United States, who have ties to terrorist groups and organizations, and they have placed us in a terrible risk.
Yeah.
President Trump has said he will take action to make certain these people are found and removed from the United States so they cannot continue to do harm and then threaten harm, and that's obviously what needs to be done.
Well, I find it really rich that now the Democrats all of a sudden are up in arms about Joe Biden needing to step out of the race because they're afraid he's going to lose. But all of this, what you're just bringing us in terms of the impact of this wide open border, did not move them. The bad policies did not move them to say, Joe Biden, get out of the way. You've put our country in a threatening and vulnerable position. I mean, Axios is reporting that the momentum to remove Biden now is losing steam. Even as the House meeting left some swing district Democrats yesterday in quote-unquote actual tears. Another report said that the meeting felt like a funeral. Colorado's Michael Bennet becoming the first Democrat senator to openly predict that Biden will lose to Trump in November. New Jersey Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, now the 7th Democrat lawmaker to publicly call for Biden to drop out of the race. But Congressman, I want to get your take on how easy or simple that would be, because I spoke with Missouri Senator Eric Schmidt, as well as New York Post columnist Miranda Devine on Sunday, and they both said, don't underestimate the will of the Biden family to keep him in place. Watch this.
I think people haven't quite given the significance to Hunter Biden's presence in the White House that it deserves. If he is in control of his father, as it appears he is effectively the commander-in-chief by proxy. And that's a very frightening thing for the country. And so anybody from the Democratic Party who's going to try and dislodge Joe Biden this week has got a very worthy adversary there. I think it will be very difficult for them to tackle Hunter Biden, especially if they underestimate him and don't realise really the kind of control and manipulation he has had for a long time over his father.
Which, Mr. Chairman, takes me back to your letter that you sent to the chief of staff at the White House. Hunter Biden's there. He's leading this effort to keep Joe in place.
Absolutely, because if President Biden is not in charge, then who is? And we certainly have seen his family rally around and now show up at the White House and in important meetings. This is very concerning. But you're right, Maria, the policies of the Biden administration are really why the American public come November want to remove the president from his position. Democrats now rising to the occasion because they see that he's going to lose. They're now sounding the alarm only after the American public watched on television that this president is not up to the job, something that they've all known for a long time.
Wow. What a cover-up. Stunning. Mr. Chairman, thank you. We'll be following your work for sure. Mike Turner joining us this morning in Washington, of course, from Ohio. Thank you, sir.